GB Cave was dug open by members of the University of Bristol Speleological Society in 1939, and it was two of the early explorers, Francis Goddard and Charles Barker, that gave their initials to its name. By the early 1960s, after prolonged and unsuccessful attempts to clear the mud choke at the terminal sump, attention turned to the high-level ladder dig series. After many digging trips, hauling out mud and stones, blasting boulders, and breaking through calcite fill, efforts eventually resulted in the discovery of the beautifully decorated Bat Passage and the large and impressive Disappointment Chamber and Great Chamber, both high up in the passages beyond the ladder dig. The first big breakthrough in the ladder dig series was getting into Helictite Grotto in 1961, more than 60 years ago. The major discoveries beyond that were made in 1966. While we were filming GB earlier this year with our modern CCD cameras and LED lights, I wondered what the original discoverers, they would now be in their late 70s or mid-80s, would have made of this film, given the 6 decades which have passed since the original explorations. Well, I subsequently tracked down 4 of these original explorers, including the 2 who were first through into Bat Passage and Disappointment Chamber in 1966. And all 4 are joining me today, 13th of August 2023, remotely, to reflect on this piece of Mendip caving history. Kit Eaton, Michael Norton, Dave Savage, and Mike Statham, a really warm welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, and thanks for bringing us all back together again after so many years.
Yes.
Right. Now, you were all students at the University of Bristol around the late 50s to mid-60s, so just a few miles from the Mendip Hills in Somerset, where GB Cave is located. And Bristol University Speleological Society was very active in cave exploration and new discoveries on Mendip at the time. I'm thinking of GB Cave and Manor Farm Swallet in particular. Can you start by giving us a picture of what the club was like in the late 50s and early 60s? And Kit, you will have the earliest memories, so can I start with you?
Well, yes, Prof. Chapman was absolutely central to the UBSS at the time, and indeed their success over the years. He lived close to the hut, he visited during the week, and we were all in awe of the breadth of knowledge, experience, his time as a POW in Singapore, etc. And I certainly don't think any of my cohort ever forgot him. And we stayed in contact with reunion lunches, etc., right up to his death. His Bedford Dormobile, known as the Trapmobile, was absolutely critical to transporting members over Mendip, particularly places like Swildens and, of course, to Ireland. However, if we don't mention his one or other interest in archaeology, some people will never forgive us.
Well, Trap was the long-standing president of the UBSS, and the long-standing treasurer was a guy called Oliver Cromwell Lloyd. The student secretary, with a few others, were elected yearly. I was member in charge of tackle and equipment in 63, 64, for instance. We used to get a big influx of members in the first year, and most of them would have had their first trip down a cave in GB, and that certainly applies to me, and it was what really got me started into caving. Most of the first year influx wouldn't come back in the second year. And it boiled down to a hardcore of people who were the mainstay of the club and stayed throughout their course and beyond.
Freshers Week was a really key point, wasn't it? We had a freshers store where we tried to lure people into the attractions of caving. And of course, the fall-off rate was quite high. I mean, you might get 30 or 40 in the first week, and then you'd be glad if 10 of those survived. And as Mike said, only the hardcore would carry on through the whole year into the next year. But it kept the UBSS as a really cosy, friendly, comradely club, because everyone knew everyone else and everyone ended up caving with the same people, and you really got a good sense of camaraderie in that.
Well, it reminds me of the first time I ever met my future wife, and that was Freshers Week, and she was standing there in a caving helmet and a carbide light with water dripping down her face.
That was the ultimate test of a relationship. If the partner survived the caving trip, there was definitely promise in the relationship.
Yeah, just to say a few more words on Trapman, Edgar Trapman. I also actually have very fond memories of him. He was born in 1899 and he died in 1978. And I met him during the UBSS expedition to County Clare in 1975. I know he was an eminent academic in the dental school of the university. He had an OBE amongst other honours, and his name will really be known to many cavers as the discoverer of Tratt's Temple in Swilden's Hole. And he was also renowned for his insights, as he said, into where you should dig, as well as his great interest in the caves of County Clare.
I checked up on this. I'm reading the old newspapers. In 1951, there was a serious cave rescue there. A group of total beginners had just wandered into the cave with the torch and some candles. They got well into the cave and dropped the torch, and it fell and they lost it. Their matches had got wet, so they couldn't light the candles, and they had to sit it out and hope that they'd be rescued. And they were rescued, but it took about 18 hours before they found out where they were, and by which time they were freezing cold and soaking wet. So the owner of the land, which I think was Axbridge Rural District Council, told the UBSS that they would have to gate the access, basically. I'm not sure when the present concrete blockhouse was built, but certainly from 1951 onwards, the cave was kept locked and UBSS held the key. Other caving clubs had more or less free access to get there, but they had to book.
I want to get a picture of what it was like, almost 60 years ago or 60 years ago. When did you as a club do most of your exploration trips, and how did you get out from the centre of Bristol to the Mendips? Kit, again, you have the earliest memories here.
I went to Bristol in 1957, and in those days, only one of us had a car. And indeed, I think that less than 20% of the members would have had a driving license. I certainly didn't. So the only way out to Mendip was on the bus from the middle of Bristol, which in those days was surrounded by bomb damage on the bus station. From the bus, you then walked up to Burrington Combe and went up to the hut. If the Trapmobile wasn't available and you wanted to go to GB or Eastwater, Longwood, etc., then you simply walked over Blackdown. And I distinctly remember walking back from GB one very clear, cold winter's night in soaking wet gear and getting back to the hut with a solid iced up armor-plated boiler suit. Because of the transport problems, certainly when I joined, all caving trips were really over the weekend, both Saturday and Sunday. And I vaguely remember various people getting transport to the end of my time, and from then onwards, sort of midweek trips became possible.
But things were much better by the time. I mean, we were about 5 or 6 years later than Kit, and by that time, most of us had a motorbike. I actually got an old van, which I managed to turn over while going down to the pub on the very sharp end of the hut track.
Going down.
And of course, you only need 2 or 3 people to have that transport, and you could arrange lifts for people who didn't have the transport. So it wasn't such a big problem in our day, in our more recent days. I only remember walking over Blackdown one time, and that was in the winter, and it was actually quite deep in snow. We were having fun actually ploughing our way over the hills in like 2 feet of snow. And by the time we got to GB, since we were wearing our newly created wetsuits, we were so hot. We were shoving snow down the chest cavity of the wetsuit to try and cool down.
Well, you mentioned the hut, Kit. UBS had and still has a hut on Mendip. And I looked it up on Wiki. It's there under the UBS site. It was formerly, I read, a ladies' cricket pavilion, and it was bought in 1919 for £5 and moved to Burrington Combe, where it still stands. Tell us something about that.
Yes, well, the hut was an absolutely crucial part of UBSS life. It's certainly been extended a couple of times since I was a member. So it's significantly bigger now than when I joined. I think the others were certainly involved in some of the extension work.
But by the time I was a member, it had the kitchen and a general store to one side, a drying room at the back, and the tackle shed, which also had drying facilities. What I do remember is that Tratt was told by the council that he had to pay rates on the hut, and he tried to say that, well, it's a portable structure, and he nailed wheels to the side to prove it. But I'm afraid it didn't wash. It is a rateable property, apparently. It had its own water supply off the roof and a catchment area in the woods, which was meant to be, one of which was meant to be potable. I never got caught anything from drinking it.
But we don't really want to mention the sanitary arrangements, do we? The rickety wooden structure which led you into fears of collapse and being dropped into a rather unsavoury deposit, should it do so while you were seated on it. Also, we were very, very chaste in those days, where there's no mixed accommodation in the hut. There was a women's quarters in a separate smaller hut, a good safe 50 metres away from the main building. And that was largely adhered to until maybe 10 years on, and then it became the married quarters.
Let's move on to GB, which we wanted to talk about. Where was GB in the exploration priorities of the club at the start of your memories?
It's certainly in my first years, GB was top of the list, caving trip, because it was very much a UBSS preserve, and we were working at the bottom of the gorge, along the sides, East Passage. We spent quite a lot of time developing a Nelly, a light railway system for shifting spoil to the face to drop over the edge. I think those rails subsequently went to Manor Farm and then back to GB for the ladder dig. But that was after my Mendip time. Each passage was where Sergeant Witts, who was then doing his national service as an ammunition examiner, gave me some instruction in the gentle art of chemical persuasion for enlarging cave passages. Again, Prof. Trapman was key to the use of explosives, being the license holder and provider. As a respected member of the community, he had the license, and I think even in those relaxed days, I'm not sure the constabulary would have been happy to have provided a bunch of students with an explosive license.
Most people who dug in GB used explosives. It was absolutely necessary. You wouldn't have got anywhere without them.
The equipment, cavers today have got a range of specialist equipment, clothing and lighting to make the cold and wet conditions more endurable. We've got one-piece fleece undersuits, we've got abrasion-resistant Cordura oversuits, we've got Kevlar knee pads, lithium-ion batteries, low-power, high-intensity LEDs. Tell us something about the gear that you used 60 years ago.
Well, when I started, 90% of Mendip cavers used carbide lamps. Now, ex-miners' knife cells were usual in Yorkshire, but Mendip was definitely stinky land. Helmets were invariably miners' compressed cardboard and not plastic. And I can remember 3 or 4 of us freshers going to Frome on the bus to a mining shop to equip ourselves when we first started deciding we'd stick to caving. Clothing was simply what you could get. Ex-army long johns were the favoured base layer, with woolen sweaters, usually topped by a very holy looking boiler suit. And cavers were always noted attendees of church and scout jumble sales, looking to supplement their caving gear.
I went out and bought myself a carbide light once I realised that I was hooked. But when I went back home on my first visit back home, that would have been at Christmas 62, 63. My father worked for the coal board and he got me a brand new knife cell. It was my pride and joy, and it lasted for years and years.
Boots were hobnail boots with nails in the bottom, and they didn't have a very good grip at all.
They wouldn't be allowed in a mine, in a coal mine, you see.
Really, really slippery. And Kit mentioned the cut compressed cardboard helmet. Well, I worked on a building site and managed to acquire this helmet, which is glass fibre. And this was my pride and joy, which I managed to keep even to this present day. And screwed a bracket on for the light. And this gave you a lot of more reassurance when you inevitably beat your head against some rock, that it would not hurt you too much.
All right, let's turn to ladder dig or GB. Before we get to ladder dig, where the two of you, Michael Norton and Dave Savage, were at the business end, and we'll come back to that in a moment. I'd really like to touch on a bit of the earlier history because it was also rather interesting. Kit, you were the first of the 4 of you in terms of your time as an undergraduate between 57 and 1960. And in terms of your visits to GB. What do you recall about your first trip there?
Certainly my very first trip as a fresher, I well remember being tremendously impressed by the size of the gorge and how it all ended in a set of fairly impassable looking cracks. Tratt was convinced that this was the way to great things. So everybody was digging through this rubble floor to open it up. And as a fresher, I did as I was told and spent many trips dragging buckets of rubble from the end of the gorge and piling it up behind a rough wall some distance from the choke, only to see it all wash back down again whenever we had a massive flood in the winter.
What was your part in the discoveries in GB, Kit?
The only claim I can make really is a lot of digging at the end of the streamway and just below the ladder dig. Major words in East Passage, blasting the stalagmite floor, and then a bar bolting up the gorge to inspect any other possibilities. Yes, Gary and I got back into the ladder dig, but it was left for later workers like the two Michaels and Dave to actually push it through and make the big breakthrough.
Doing some of my research for this, there's a 9-page article in the Proceedings of the UBSS in 1961 by Eric Gilbert, and he describes the exploration of East Passage, a 75-foot climb up into a passage called Whitsun Folly, high up in the gorge. And I understand you were central to that, Kit.
Yes, it was in my second year. We built an ID, an intense illuminating device out of a motorbike headlight and several 6-volt batteries. Heavy and nothing like your modern lights, Michael. But to us at the time, it was like Blackpool illuminations. And it was used for a detailed examination of the upper walls and roof of the gorge. Many weekends were spent bolting our way up to anything that looked interesting, which is how we found Whitsun Folly. Climbing up wasn't too bad. The really hairy stuff came whenever we tried to move horizontally to get closer to interesting features. And finally, after hearing digging sounds from East Passage, we realized that wasn't going to go anywhere after much toil and trouble. So the only thing left was down at the bottom on the old ladder dig. We started there, just before Christmas 1960, and got a bolt some 20, 30 feet up. Gary had another try after the New Year's party, but came off. So next weekend, on the 10th of January, I had a go and also ended up with sore ribs and another badly bent roll bolt. However, using his prehensile eyebrows and a lot of faith, Gary got a Eaton and a 40-foot ladder just above where I'd fallen off, and then got to the top and brought me up. As I passed the Eaton and the ladder, both of them fell off, which didn't improve the nerves. It was later that night, Gary sat in the plume of feathers and said, "Those members who consider GB to be just the Saturday afternoon final walk can find a venture fraught with danger if they try hard enough."
All right, now to ladder dig. That's what I wanted to talk mostly about. You again, Kit, you told me that you'd spotted the evidence of early attempts to get up to the ladder dig extension on your very first visit to GB.
Oh yes, I was told that there was the broken ladder and a broken rung and some wires way up on the top, and I was told at the time, "Oh yes, the ladder dig." We maypoled up there a long time ago, but we don't have maypole now, and the ladder broke, so nobody's been there for years and years. I didn't know when the original entrance was made, and although I've tried searching the old logbooks, I haven't found a date. But at the time, really the push was in the bottom of the gorge, where Trapp was convinced the passages there were going to lead us straight through to Cheddar.
Okay, so you next got into the ladder dig extensions when?
10th of January 1960.
When and why did the club eventually decide to concentrate on the ladder dig region?
At the time, because it was the only thing left in the gorge. Trapp's excavations down in the terminal sump area amongst those very narrow passages were clearly going to take a very, very long time to get anywhere. And East Passage had totally given up. So the ladder dig was the only thing that was left. But I left 6 months after we got back in, and we'd not made any real progress into pushing further. And the others were all involved in that.
Mike, you had some memories of when the work in the ladder dig started again.
It was decided in a committee meeting in January 1964 that the only real option for digging in GB was at the end of the ladder dig, at which time it was about 90 feet long. It ended in a chamber beautifully decorated with heliactites and stalagmites and stalactites, and people didn't want to destroy it, which digging would have done. But I managed to convince people that at the committee meeting that if you wanted to get on, it really was the only option, and it was agreed. And Dave and I went down probably the very next weekend. It's in the logbook, Dave.
It is. Yes, I remember.
Michael, you were saying that Trapp was the mastermind.
When I started, I was in the last phase of futile attempts at digging in the main. Gorge.
Yeah.
And everyone had this sort of ideal of the Cheddar Master Cave, because all the waters that ran down GB and August Longwood and Manor Farm had been dye tested, and they emerged at Cheddar. So there was this wonderful image of just get on this, beyond this initial obstacle, and then there's this grand cave going all the way to Cheddar. Of course, that never turned out to be the case, but that was what drove people to try and go the main route, i.e. follow the main passage in GB. But at that time, it was obviously futile. As Kit said, the water would just wash away what you'd dug out the last 3 months before. So the older passages, like Ladder Dig, were full of just mud and rocks, which you could get out. And once they were out, you weren't going to get them washed in again. So at least you could guarantee your progress. So it just started. I mean, that time there were those digs going in the Ladder Dig, and there was a dig going in Manor Farm, and people just joined in planned trips. Sometimes it was led by Chapman, sometimes by one of us, and gradually progress was made. The technique, the passage was quite low. I mean, you couldn't stand, you could kneel. It was basically to chip away and dig away the mud and the small rocks as far as you could, and just pass those behind you with a bucket. But sometimes you got faced with a rather more formidable obstacle, and that's when you actually use a couple of sticks of dynamite very carefully, and just to loosen up that obstacle, and then move the rest of the looser stuff out again. And that went on for must be almost 2 years before we finally got to the breakthrough.
Was all this beyond the Helictite grotto? Because Helictite was found in 61.
Yes, it was definitely beyond the Helictite grotto. Yeah.
Okay. So you've dug into the logbooks, Mike, and you were trying to estimate how many digging trips were involved.
Not all trips got written up, but I've looked reasonably carefully at the logbooks. They're a bit different, all different people's handwriting and such like, and there's the water damage to them as well. But I counted about 24 trips, and there would have been more than that. So probably 24 to 30 trips before the breakthrough was achieved, I think is fairly safe.
You'd be making really good progress if you actually moved forward 2 feet, let alone a full yard or meter, because everything took quite a lot of effort to dig out, and you had to move it back. You'd have a sort of human chain with a bucket most of the time, just lugging it out
and throwing it back down into the gorge.
No, we never took it that far.
Oh, okay. All right. So tell us about the big breakthrough, the breakthrough into the boulder choke and passages beyond. So that was 1966, Michael?
That's right. I mean, we were just following a series of digs. There'd been one a couple of weeks ago, I think, involving trout, which had needed to use some explosive to remove some large rock. And Dave and I went there, and we found that at the end of the dig, the roof was actually looking quite loose. So we actually sat below this loose area with a crowbar, and we tried to prise the rocks and make sure they fell between our legs rather than onto one of our legs, and then move them behind. And we gradually loosened up a point that was a passable hole. And then Dave was up there with no hesitation at all, and led the way through the new passage while I followed and tried to remember the way back in case we had trouble finding our way back. Because it turned out it was quite a good find. Dave followed the holes and navigable squeezes between boulders with an intact wall on the right, and that led us to back passage, which was the beautiful, pristine decorations, which which included bat skeletons, which is why we call it Bat's Passage. And it also included some rather beautiful formations. It had some nice flowstones we called poached eggs, because they were white with a orangey center. And there were some beautiful red stalactites we called the carrots. We must have, I really lost track of time. I was thinking how can I find my way back to the entrance hole, and will the boulders have fallen down and blocked it by the time we get back there? So I was half following Dave and half thinking about the way back. So I think Dave should tell us a bit
but
more.
On that, just to be clear, it was on that breakthrough trip you got into most of Bat Passage, or pretty
Yes,
much?
Yeah. So Dave, yeah.
Yes, we did. Yes, what was very significant about the breakthrough was that unexpectedly we were moving solid material from the roof. And as we went through, it suddenly occurred to me that what we were breaking through was a floor, a false floor to the actual ladder dig passage. So in effect, we climbed through the roof and found ourselves on a flat, smooth floor, which was in fact the roof of the ladder dig passage. A little bit unexpected, but once we realized we got through, we were away. And it's one of those things that happen when you are in a passage that nobody's ever seen before. In fact, no living thing has ever been in before, that you can't help but move fast. And we were looking at things as we went along, but the whole point was that the way was open in front of us, and we just carried on. How long it took to get into that passage, I don't know, but probably not more than about 15 to 20 minutes. And by that time, we were well away with the exploration. And again, once we were into Bat Passage, we did some oohs and ahs as we looked to the side, up in front of us and into the roof. But we just kept moving. And it would have been very difficult to stop us moving at that stage, believe me. And it was probably only another 20 minutes before we reached what we thought was probably the end of that part of Bat Passage. And we could see that, yes, it was closing down, and perhaps somebody else would like to have a look at that at some stage. But we'd seen, as we went through, that there were other possibilities at the side. So we came back and climbed up through the boulders, which had been on our left-hand side as we broke into Bat Passage. And almost immediately, the way was open, and we climbed through into what we now call Disappointment Chamber. It was quite a large chamber, and we could see that the way on lay at the end of the chamber, or appeared to lay at the end of the chamber. But by this time, I think we were prepared to tell everybody else that there was a discovery, and it wasn't fair if we did all the exploration before other people got a chance to have a look around.
So you not only got to the end of that passage, but you also discovered Disappointment Chamber on that first breakthrough trip.
Yes. And we also knew that there were other openings above us in the boulders, which could almost certainly lead to something else. And knowing that large amounts of collapsed boulders inevitably mean a chamber above, we knew that there was probably another chamber up above us. But we very definitely made a decision that it was time that we went and reported our discoveries and let others in on the action, as it were.
When we were in the chamber, which turned out to be Disappointment Chamber, I remember having come through a hole and standing in the chamber. It was far from obvious where the hole we'd come from was. And after we moved around the floor of the chamber a bit, it a non-trivial task finding the entrance hole again.
No, that's true. Because the boulders were completely fresh, they didn't have any marks on them, so all routes looked exactly the same going back. Whereas normally, if you're climbing through boulders, the way through is pretty obvious because there are marks of other people's progress.
Well, I can say that even today, it's still quite a complex place to negotiate.
Oh, yes,
so,
yes, indeed. Yeah.
You know, I still find this quite remarkable that you did all this. Mike Statham, you missed out on the breakthrough trip.
Oh, what a shame it was, yes. But I happened to be getting married that weekend, so there was no chance of me going caving.
All right. Was Tratt himself involved in the discoveries in these
Not directly, no. Tratt wasn't actually there, but that isn't to say that he hadn't been in the ladder dig and had in fact himself placed explosives. In fact, I remember being in the old Speleo rooms below the geography department at the university, and Tratt came in very excited, said he'd had a dream the night before, and the dream was that he'd set up a charge in the ladder dig, which was true enough. But he'd gone the next day and discovered that the way was open and that he'd walked all the way to Cheddar.
Okay.
But he said it was only a dream. But in fact, as it turned out, it was a little bit prescient because it wasn't long after that we actually made the breakthrough.
Tratt did help, in the subsequent trips, and because of the need to protect this new extension, we wanted to install an actual gate. So he got the university workshops to make a square metal frame and a door. And I, Tratt, and my fiance at that time walked down to the ladder dig with a bucket of cement and concrete and a metal frame, and the three of us installed this gate. So Tratt was pretty active even in those.
It's still, by the way, the gate is still there, and there is a really well corroded padlock lying by the side of it, dated from that time. As I was saying, I mean, visitors today, it's still a tricky place to find and get to. Disappointment Chamber might seem something of a misnomer. It's a large boulder floored chamber, beautifully decorated with calcite formations, lots of stalactites, stalagmites, and misshapen helictites. Why the name Disappointment Chamber?
Well, the disappointment was simply because as soon as we saw the chamber, we thought, this is the way on. This is the big passageway that Tratt predicted, and we're just going to walk to Cheddar now. And a few yards further along, when things started to close down and we couldn't really find any obvious way through the boulders, that we became disappointed and the name stuck. And that was it, Disappointment Chamber. Yeah, we sometimes did think, perhaps we shouldn't have called it that after all, but that was the first name that came to mind, and these things tend to stick. The first name, first person through, usually gives the name to a passage.
Yeah. Well, as I said, it still seems remarkable to me, given the complexity and scale of the place, that you actually got through the boulder choke and that passage and got into Disappointment all on this first breakthrough trip. But you didn't get into Great Chamber on this visit, can you?
No.
Someone tell us something about the discovery of Great Chamber and your memories of getting into it for the first time.
Well, my memories are that I suspected there was a chamber above, and there were several people all at the same time moving up through the boulders. And I still can't remember precisely who was the first into the chamber. In fact, I think one of the female members was probably first. But I'm not certain about that. I think essentially there were 3 or 4 of us in almost at the same time. And once we were in there, we all dispersed at various corners of the chamber, seeing if we could find a way on. But we spent quite a lot of time looking for alternative ways through the boulders, and nothing came to light, except I think at the far end of the chamber we did manage to penetrate about perhaps 60 or 70 feet down, and some of the boulders were a little bit dangerous looking, so we didn't push that too hard. But subsequently people have gone a little bit further down. I don't know anything about how far people have got there.
Great Chamber is big on the scale of Mendip Chambers caverns. It's big. You must have been really excited seeing it for the first time.
Oh, absolutely, yes. It was. I mean, we couldn't believe that this was going to be just a chamber, and that it wasn't going to provide us with a way on. So perhaps that should have been called Disappointment Chamber instead. But no. Fortunately, the name Great Chamber stuck. I've been in other places where I've broke through into chambers, and I think of all the places I've been to, that was probably one of the most exciting. Yeah, simply because it was in a cave that we knew well, and this had been predicted for so long that there was a way on somewhere.
And the beauty of the pristine
absolutely
as well. That was really quite startlingly beautiful in Back Passage, and also the larger formations in the walls and roof of the Disappointment Chamber.
That's right, yes.
So, I mean, with hindsight, it does seem a little strange to call it Disappointment Chamber. We should have called it Excitement Chamber, because that was our status. We weren't so much disappointed on that day. We were
no, anything but. No.
I think for someone going in today, you get into this chamber, it's a struggle getting in, and you get there and you think, wow, why was it called Disappointment? We should just mention, I mean, it was great that I was able to track the four of you down, but there were many other people involved in these digs and these discoveries, many of whom sadly are no longer with us.
Pete Standing, who sadly passed away a couple of years ago now, Peter was a great caver and a great climber. We did a lot of caving together over the years, and I remember going into Back Passage with Peter, and his climbing ability was such that he could climb a wall a little bit like a spider could, and he just simply climbed up a smooth wall in Back Passage into the one of the avens up there, and made a very, very thorough search of the roof. So after that trip, we knew that there weren't any ways on in the roof of Back Passage, and that was, as I say, Peter Standing doing his thing, which was climbing into impossible places. He also did something similar in Great Chamber as well. I remember seeing him up in the roof and thinking, Peter, how on earth did you get up there? And he said, I have no idea. But he says, I'm not at all sure how I'm going to get down again. But he did find a way down eventually. Yeah. And
there were a lot of members who contributed to the dig at some stage, either by helping out and of course, once Dave and I showed that the passage and extension existed, the following trips were quite well attended, and I'm sure you were there, Mike, and everyone else went not only just to see if they could extend the exploration, but to survey it and start drawing a survey of it. So, I mean, it's difficult to remember, but Tim Hill was one, even Chris Gilmore, Keith Hanna, Mike Garrett, Colin High, Maura High. There's quite a long list of the membership in those days.
All right.
You remember the photograph of Back Passage that got published? I think it was on the front page of possibly The Guardian. I can't remember, but it's in the write-up in Proceedings. The person holding the light there, I'm sure, is Deborah Keziah Simmons.
Debbie Simmons, yes, it was. I think you're right.
Michael Norton. After we'd finished this filming of GB just very recently, I was digging into the UBS proceedings, and it was your paper, your 1966 paper, that describe the discoveries, the passages, the chambers beyond Ladder Dig, entered in 1966. But it's a description of the passages and their geology with nothing about the challenges and excitement and emotions in getting through to the place. I asked Dave for his sort of emotional reactions. Can you tell us something about your reactions breaking through?
Well, the UBSS proceedings is meant to be an academic.
I know this.
That's why it is a dry reading to
Yes.
someone who prefers the Sunday supplements, and as full of measurements and historical facts. But I mean, basically, Dave was the one setting the pace after we broke through. I think I remember being maybe responsible for prizing out the last rock that opened the hole, and of course you get that excitement, and there's a sort of sense of wonderment again that you can find it and you can be the first ones to look at it, but also the sense of wonderment that this has been there all the time, never been seen by the human race, but we did find it had been seen by bats because their skeletons were in there. So that opened up lots of imagination. Say, how on earth did they get in? Was there a hidden entrance somewhere which is now closed? And it gives you this sense of time beyond our.
Can any of you say anything about the surveying of these new discoveries? Were you involved in that? The equipment used, the people involved?
Oh yeah, we all took part in the surveying, but very, very primitive. It's just a tape and a compass and sort of.
Yes, we learnt our surveying skills in the caves of Western Ireland.
That's right.
The caving was relatively straightforward, and the surveying was again relatively straightforward, using RAF and bearing compasses and metal reinforced tapes, and using our common sense as well. We used to use very simple techniques, but the final survey was often surprisingly accurate. We usually managed to do a closure, which was very rarely out by more than a few feet. So that meant that we'd done a good job on the accuracy of our initial work.
I did find a rather nice picture of a balloon which had been used for measuring the height of the gorge and the main chamber during the surveys in the 1940s and 50s. I guess that predated your involvement.
Yes, it did. Yes. Yeah.
Mike referred to some headlines in the newspapers, and he's actually dug out some of the press coverage from the first discoveries in 1941, which he sent over to me. And there's some great articles there from the Western Daily Press and the Bath Chronicle and the Illustrated London News. And there was one I particularly liked where the headline said, "Stalactites in the immense GB cavern, never before penetrated."
That's the sort of language I couldn't use in the paper.
Well, it was wartime, mate. You needed a good laugh.
Okay. Right. Today, if you go into Great Chamber, in the bottom of Great Chamber, in the floor of Great Chamber, close to the rather prominent broken pillar, there's a tight slot down which takes you back down into another part of the boulder choke, far below the original point of entry into the chamber. And it provides rather an interesting round trip today. Were you aware of this? I don't know whether this more awkward connection was only made much later.
I think it must have been made much later than our time in the cave. I certainly don't recall anything like that.
Okay.
We found passages that went down into the boulder ruckle, as Dave says, but these were more like linear forays, just seeing how far we could get, and we didn't do any lateral connections while I was there.
No, I don't remember any connections.
No.
Are there any active digs there now? Do you know?
Not to my knowledge.
The last time I was in GB would have been in the old age. It would have been in the mid-70s, and it was near the very end of the cave. and people had been digging at the far end and getting nowhere. And stepping back it's such a long time ago, but let's say 10 yards further back from where they'd been digging, there appeared to be a low entrance at floor level. And I dug that a couple of weekends running with another guy and broke through. And I got very excited, and it went down for about, I can't remember, but it must have been at least 30 feet, 30 feet, no more than that. I can imagine, I remember it was quite a steep decline, but it ended in what was obviously an area that there was silt on the floor. So it was an area where water rose to that level. And it was obviously going to be a dead end. But I've never really, I don't know whether it's on the survey now. I did write it up in the logs, but the logs aren't online for that period.
Well, I understand that there was quite a lot of attempts at digging at the end of Back Passage, where there are a lot of phreatic tubes which were full of mud and silt. And there were I understand there were some small extensions, but nothing that really broke through. And I think nowadays it's not actively dug.
No.
I heard about an underground camp, a 3-day camp. Were any of you involved in that?
Yes.
That was, go on, Dave.
And I certainly were. There was Dave Fatmore, Mike, you, Mike, me. I can't remember everybody else, but
no, there was only 3 others.
Was it only 3? Oh,
yeah.
Just Dave Patmore, you and me. It seemed like a crowd, but but I remember.
I don't know if you remember, Dave, but we'd had a lecture from Michel Siffre.
I remember it well. Yes.
Yeah, who'd spent
several months underground.
2 months underground, camped on a glacier with he was able to speak to the surface, but the surface couldn't speak to him. That's and right, it was a scientific experiment. And he very quickly lost track of time, and he altered his regime from 24 hours to 48. So after 2 months, he thought he'd been in the cave only 1 month.
Yeah. Now, surprising.
And we decided to go down and test this theory. And we could spend our time digging.
And it certainly did have an effect. We did not realise being down 3 days. It seemed much less time than that. But yes, it was an interesting experiment. I don't think we had a deal of work done. We were supposed to be doing some digging, but how much we did, I really don't know. It was very little. Most of the time was spent cooking, talking, and sleeping, I think.
After these major discoveries that we've been talking about, 1966, there was the great Mendip flood of July 68. And the flood had a major impact on a number of Mendip caves, of course, transforming the 40-foot in Swildens into today's 8-foot climb, and opening up entrances to things like Upper Flood, Swallet, and others. And I think altering some of the passages in GB as well.
It did, yes. I wrote a short paper for Proceedings about that. I haven't seen it recently, but I think I do describe some effects of the flood. And it really was quite amazing that boulders, which we reckoned must have weighed several hundred tons, had actually moved. Probably due to the fact that they were supported by smaller boulders, which had been moved by the water, but certainly the whole of the gorge had been transformed, and various things that we were used to climbing down and over had just disappeared completely.
Big effect on Manor Farm. But we'd been digging Manor Farm for years and years, and gradually reinforced. This was through a muddy entrance to the Swallet, so it was rather slippery and easily washed down in the winter. But concrete pipes have been put in there to stabilize it. And in '66, we actually got through. This was a floor from the top down in the floor, and we all rushed down. But within about 10 minutes, while we were still exploring this narrow bedding plane, we started feeling rocks coming down, whizzing past our heads, and realized the support of the entrance was collapsing.
And
So
we got out fast. Yes, I remember that.
we really did get out just in time, because everyone got out. And the next morning, the entire entrance had collapsed. And so we were right to go. And following that, we decided to dig a shaft through the solid rock to reconnect with the cave that we had briefly seen. And we then spent the next 2 years digging this vertical shaft through solid rock. And we were just about at the right depth to find again the missing cave, when that flood washed out the great big sinkhole about 30 meters away, and we realized we'd been digging slightly in the wrong place.
Manor Farm is another story.
It is indeed.
I want to drag you back to GB, and I want to ask you now, when was your last trips into GB? Do you have any recollection?
I'll start. I've told you mine already. It would have been in the mid-70s, my last trip to GB.
Right, okay.
Yes, I think I could say roughly the same thing. It would have been late 70s, perhaps, but my recollections are almost the same as Mike's, that it was the dig at the end had almost closed down. But that, yes, 1977, I think it was, yes, but not since then.
I don't think I've been back to GB since I graduated with my doctorate in '68. I have been back to Swildon's, but not to GB.
I went back several times after I graduated in '60. And my last time into GB would be somewhere around about the late '60s. I certainly been into Great Chamber. Vaguely remember that. I'm really looking forward to seeing your film, Michael.
All right, okay. So this is a good lead in. I think what we're going to do is take a sort of break from the discussion, and I'm going to let my guests see part of the film that Nick Thorne and myself have just completed. And I put an email out to members of the Mendip Caving group to ask if anyone was aware of any other video recordings, filming of Disappointment Chamber and Great Chamber. And I didn't get any response to that. So whether this is actually the first time they've been filmed, I'm not sure. But I'm going to show you a couple of minutes of a couple of the highlights of the bridge, of Disappointment Chamber and Great Chamber. And we'll rejoin in a moment and hear your reactions for that. So I'm brought back some memories.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
You fancy another trip down, Mike?
It is tempting, isn't it? Yes.
We might not be quite as fit as we think we are. Looking at some of those squeezes, it seemed like nothing at the time, but these days it might feel a bit different.
No, but that's quite a long way in, of course. I think we should try and close up. I know that some of you were involved in many other discoveries around the country. It would be good to talk about, but I think we should perhaps move on. Your club is still very active today, and it was actually through Graham Mullen that I was able to track some of you down. Do any of you maintain any contacts with the club?
My group, both preceding my time at Bristol and just afterwards, have stuck together remarkably well. We've had an annual reunion, lunch and dinner, which Trat and Oliver used to attend when they were with us. And we've met every single year since 1960, apart from COVID. And according to Cyril's spreadsheet, we've had an average of attendance of 14 people over that period. But the people you meet caving, you tend to stick to. You know them pretty well by the time you dangled on the end of a lifeline that they've held you for. The other thing, of course, is there's the excellent nowadays newsletter, which I look forward to seeing every month. And indeed, that's how you manage to connect with us, Michael.
Yep, indeed. Well, yeah, like all sports and pastimes, caving can remain a bit of a lifelong passion. And I saw some nice words in Trapman's obituary in 1978, and it said there that dentistry was his profession, but speleology was his life. And I suppose something a bit similar goes for many of us. Shall we leave it there? I mean, we've been looking back over this 6 decades. We know that your discoveries have left a wonderful trip for sporting cavers today, 60 years on. Congratulations, from me. It's been great to meet you and talk to you 60 years on. As an astonishing accompaniment to our little film that when you see the whole thing, I hope you'll feel it does the system justice. Kit Eaton, Mike Statham, Michael Norton, Dave Savage, thank you so much for joining me today.